Over the weekend, the United States and Israel carried out targeted strikes in Iran. We acknowledge these actions were designed to prevent Iran from continuing to threaten international peace and security. New Zealand has consistently condemned the Iranian regime. Successive New Zealand governments have held the position that Iran must dismantle its nuclear program, stop its support of proxy terrorist groups, and end the repression of its people. But for decades now, Iran has defied the will and expectations of the international community. The legitimacy of a government rests on the support of its people. The Iranian regime has long since lost that support in the most brutal way possible. New Zealand stands with the brave people of Iran, and in recent weeks they have taken to the streets to demand regime change, only to be met by violence and murder. The Iranian people must be allowed to determine their future and to live free from fear of their own government. The violence overseen by the Iranian regime has extended beyond its borders. It is responsible for much of the instability and terror experienced throughout the Middle East over the decades. Iran has been presented with multiple opportunities through diplomacy to dismantle its nuclear program and end its support for the terrorist proxy groups. It has chosen not to heed those calls. We condemn in the strongest terms Iran's indiscriminate retaliatory attacks in the Gulf and more broadly. We cannot risk further regional escalation, and civilian life must be protected. Our thoughts go out to all of those affected by the conflict and to the New Zealand families who are understandably worried about their loved ones living in or travelling through the region. New Zealand embassies in the region are closely monitoring the situation and will continue to provide consular support to New Zealanders. As of this morning, 1,750 Kiwis in the Middle East have registered on safe travel. Over 1,000 of those are in the UAE, 71 are in Israel, and 26 are in Iran. In reality, the numbers of New Zealanders in the region is likely to be much higher. We therefore urge people to register on safe travel as soon as possible so that we can communicate with them directly. Our advice to them is to follow the advice of local authorities, including shelter-in-place recommendations, and to leave when it is safe and possible to do so. With 19,000 flights disrupted globally and airspace in the Gulf likely to continue to be closed, I am conscious that travelling New Zealanders will already be feeling the impact. My advice for those flying through the Middle East is to contact your travel provider or airline quickly to discuss options. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs has added 8 more countries to the Do Not Travel list, and people can find the list on the Safe Travel website, but it includes obviously most of the Middle East. Here at home, New Zealand Police have also increased visibility and are in contact with affected communities. New Zealand joins the international community in hoping that this crisis ends as quickly as possible. We call for a resumption of negotiations and adherence to international law, and we urge the Iranian leadership to seek a negotiated solution that returns Iran to the community of nations. And with that, I'm happy to take your questions.
Prime Minister, the US-Israel attack. The US-Israel attack. Do you believe there was a breach of international law there?
Well, again, we're not best placed to make that assessment. We weren't party we weren't proxy or party to these attacks. They're independently launched by the US and Israel. They will have information and intelligence that we haven't received. We weren't briefed in advance. We haven't had subsequent assert whether these are legal actions or not. And you've seen that with the UN and the Security Council where they have invoked. But for them, it's ultimately. But from New Zealand's point of view, we've had a long-standing condemnation of the Iranian regime. This is a regime, I just want to be really clear, that is killing its own people. This is a regime that has been funding terrorism all around the world, causing that's been pursuing a nuclear weapons program despite endless rounds of diplomacy, breaking international law. So, we ultimately, issues of legality is for Israel and the US to talk to because we're not party to that information or that intelligence they may have.
You yourself talk a lot about the importance of international law, upholding that. So armed intervention without Security Council sign-off, is that a breach of international law?
Well, again, I've answered that question, which is to say we are not party to the information or the intelligence that the US or Israel may have. We haven't been involved in these. We weren't given advance notice. We haven't had subsequent briefings on any of that. That is up for them to assert that these are actions that are consistent with international law.
Minister, once you do see more of the evidence behind the move, will you make a judgment on that?
Well, again, that is up to whether we even get shared with the information and the intelligence. That is, the independent actions of two countries have launched these attacks. They will have information and intelligence that we have not been party to or have seen, and that is why I just simply say, as you've heard other leaders around the world say, it's up to those countries to actually assert the legal basis for these.
Prime Minister, we weren't party to the intelligence that Vladimir Putin had before he invaded Ukraine. You were happy to call that attack illegal on the day it happened. What's the difference here?
Well, I want to be clear, the Ukrainian government and regime has not been brutally killing and murdering its own people. The Ukrainian regime has not been illegally pursuing an international, breaking international law, pursuing a nuclear weapon. The Iranian regime administration has not been funding international global terrorism around the world. So I wouldn't make that association between those two cases.
Does the actions of the Iranian regime therefore excuse what the US and Israel have done?
Well, what I'd say is New Zealand has long supported actions to prevent Israel from getting access to a nuclear weapon. New Zealand has long supported actions to make sure that Iran doesn't repress and kill its own people. We've long supported actions that actually are making sure it doesn't fund international terrorists. Those have been long-standing positions of the New Zealand governments under different colours and different political parties and persuasions for many, many decades now, right from 1979. So that has been a long-standing position. This is an evil regime that has killing its own people. By even just in the last few months, the estimates have been tens of thousands of people have been killed because they're protesting out on the streets, wanting freedom and wanting wanting government to represent them and their people better.
Have you seen advice?
Sorry, hang on. Sorry, Henry. I'll go to Jenna.
In that case, there have been calls for New Zealand to designate the IRGC as a terrorist entity. Will you do that?
Again, that has been a process, as you know, around terrorism designation that we have separately from this event. But suffice to say that I think we'll have a decision on that very shortly.
Just some clarification around the difference in wording between New Zealand's statement and Australia and Canada's statement. So Australia and Canada released near identical statements saying that they supported the action. New Zealand didn't go quite as far, saying we acknowledge the reasons behind it. Why did we use that slightly softer language?
Well, we have our own independent foreign policy, as we've spoken about before. We'll express our views in our own language, and that's what we have done with our statement that the Minister of Foreign Affairs and myself both presented yesterday. But I'd just say to you, when you look at what the Australian Foreign Minister has said in subsequent conversations, even with the Prime Minister of Australia, they're saying pretty much the same things. They're saying that we understand the reasons for this and why this has happened. They've got, they also do not want to see Iran ever with a nuclear weapon, and they also acknowledge, though, that they can't talk to it because they are also not proxy to the inside information that Israel or the US has as well. So I don't see, you can argue the semantics of it, but I don't think our positions are that different.
Everything in foreign affairs is semantics. So why did we choose acknowledge?
Because we're an independent country with our own independent foreign policy. We express it as we see fit. But I'm just saying to you, go back and look at the statement, say, of a foreign minister like Penny Wong, and I don't think you'll find too much difference in our point of view.
So we did have a handful of people, I understand, operating in the Middle East, military personnel, who had been involved in identifying targets in relation to other security matters there with Western forces. Do we currently have any military personnel serving alongside any American forces or other forces in the Middle East?
Look, I can't talk to where our personnel are operationally. You will know that they've also been partaking and participating for many years, actually, around UN security missions as well across the Middle East. But all I can tell you is that NZDF staff, our MFAT staff, are all personally safe.
Prime Minister, have you received any advice from MFAT on the legality or lack thereof of the attacks on Iran?
Look, I just can't comment on that. Cabinet rules preclude me from doing so.
Be normal in these circumstances for advice to be provided to Cabinet without going into the detail? Would it be normal in these circumstances?
Well, again, I'm just not going to talk about legal advice because that's not permitted under the Cabinet rules.
Sorry, hang on. I just want to go someone else here. Sorry, Thomas.
Can you take any steps to ensure that intelligence gathered by New Zealand assets is not deployed via the Five Eyes arrangement to war aims which New Zealand would not agree with?
Well, again, I've tried to answer that pretty clearly, which is this is independent action from the US and Israel. We have not been party to intelligence or information. We were not given we were not given advance notice, and we have not been given subsequently a detailed briefing around that.
The United States is allowed to take our intelligence via that agreement. Can you take any efforts to ensure that that intelligence is not deployed in a way that New Zealand would find unethical or unconscionable?
Well, I just would say to you, again, I can't go beyond what I've said, which is that the Americans and the Israelis have made their own internal, and based off information that they have, their own internal intelligence. We have not been party or party to any of those conversations or provision of information or intelligence.
Sean's question about deployment.
Sorry, hang on, Joe, can I
Just further to Sean's question about deployment. So the NZDF has said we've got 60 personnel in the Middle East. Did we have to evacuate anyone from the US base in Bahrain ahead of that attack?
I'm going to let the Chief of Defence talk to that, and I'll let him answer that. But all I can reassure you is what he's reassured me on in our many conversations over the weekend, is that our people are safe, which is important.
Just following on from Thomas's questions, in terms of any sort of evidence that the US and Israel might have had for those attacks, given you aren't aware of it, that hasn't been passed on to you, if it never is passed on to you, which you suggested before, you may never know the reason or rationale for it, are you comfortable with a superpower like the US, that we work so closely with in terms of the Five Eyes relationship, making these sorts of decisions that affect the entire world, and we as a country who are extremely close to the US are none the wiser as to why that decision may or may not have been made?
Well, again, all I can talk to you is to say very simply, we have a long-standing commitment and set of condemnations about actions that actually, any actions taken by this former regime to actually pursue nuclear weapons is something we have no interest in. We are not supportive of that whatsoever. We're not supportive of a regime that's killing its people. We're not supportive of a regime funding terrorism. So that's been a long-standing New Zealand commitment over many decades, over many different governments. With respect to this attack, this is an independent actions of two nation states that have their own intelligence and their own information. I can't second guess that. I'm not party to that. I don't receive that information to know on the basis on which they have seen to actually launch these attacks, whether that's a legal basis or any other intelligence they may have. And
we will be very terrified to be living in a world now, though, where it is completely acceptable for superpowers like this to make those unilateral decisions without any information provided, perhaps ever, to other countries who they have fought alongside previously, have trade deals with, whatever, and no information is ever provided about why they have launched such a massive attack that has had huge ramifications for the rest of the world.
At the end of the day, every country, as I've been saying to you now for 2 years, acts in its own national interests. New Zealand has our own independent foreign policy. We act in our own national interests, both in a defence and a security and a trade sense and a people-to-people sense. That's what we do as well. And so it's up for each individual country, will act in their own national interests, and that's exactly what's happened here.
Have you asked for that information?
Sorry?
Have you asked for that information?
No.
Are you comfortable not knowing that information?
Well, again, I'm just saying to you, the US and Israel have their own deep intelligence, deep information networks, I would imagine, in this region. We are not central to this region. We're a long, long way away from it. They have made an assessment based off the information and intelligence that they must have about the legal basis for this attack, but also about the rationale for doing this attack. All I can say is, in zooming out, is that as New Zealand, we've had a long-standing, commitment under successive governments that any actions that stops Iran from getting a nuclear weapon is a good thing. Any actions that take to stop them from sponsoring terrorism is a good thing. Any actions that stops them from killing their own people is a good thing. This is not a good regime, and that has been a long-standing position of New Zealand governments under different administrations. And so that's as far as I can say. I haven't got anything else to add to that.
Minister, in your opinion, is there an organised enough opposition within Iran to actually take over control of that country?
Again, I've only seen what you've seen in terms of media reports, essentially. To say that the Americans obviously feel that there is a series of leadership that potentially can emerge from here. But again, I'm not in a position to comment on that.
Agree with that assessment by the US?
Well, again, I'm just not in a position to comment on that. All I know is that the current regime, since 1979, has brutally repressed its people. We all remember the story of that 22-year-old young woman who was actually, lost her life under the custody of the morality police because she wasn't wearing her hijab correctly. Well, that is a brutal administration when the government is killing its own people in the way that it has. We've seen the tens of thousands of people lose their lives just in the last month or so because of the protests out on the street. And so I don't want you to be under any pretenses. This is New Zealand has had a long-standing commitment and commitment to actions that means that Iran doesn't get its hand on nuclear weapons, doesn't drive terrorism, and doesn't kill its people.
You said New Zealand's had a long-term position that we support.
We've long supported actions.
Any actions that would stop Iran developing a nuclear weapon?
Sorry?
Would we support carpet bombing the country?
Well, I mean, we obviously understand. We're not saying that. What we're saying is that we understand this. I don't know how to be any clearer, guys. I mean, we've had a long set. Sorry?
Any action.
Well, we've long supported actions under our governments, under successive political parties, that actually stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons. There have been endless rounds of diplomacy where Iran has flagrantly disregarded international law with respect to nuclear weapons programs. That has not worked. It has not borne fruit, the diplomacy efforts. The second thing I'd say is that when you see them sponsoring proxies like the Houthi and like Hezbollah and other terrorism groups all around the world, where there's been a huge loss of life, that is unacceptable. And when you see a regime that's been so brutally repressive of its own people, and particularly women and lots of other, is unacceptable. So, that has been a position of ours. It's a values-driven position that's a regime that's not a good regime.
Do you believe the West has any part to play in how that relationship has deteriorated, given that Trump did pull out of the original Iran deal, which Obama negotiated, and given that there were ongoing negotiations when this bombing started?
There have been ongoing negotiations about Iran's nuclear weapons program for decades, and they have not borne fruit. And I want to be really clear about that because there have been endless negotiations, and Iran has failed to uphold those agreements, and also has continued to break international law around them.
What we're asking is there any limit?
Sorry?
What we're asking is there any limit to something being a good thing if it's designed to stop Iran having nukes?
Well, again, it's a hypothetical question you're essentially asking. What I can say,
based on what you said,
I can say is we can support goals that means that Iran doesn't get its hands on nuclear weapons. We can support goals that means they're not going to continue terrorism around the world. We can support goals that means that a regime is going to stop killing its own people in the way that it has. So, that's what we identify with.
The armed intervention.
Sorry?
So do you support the armed intervention in Iran?
Well, again, I'm not party, as I've said to you before. This is independent action from the US and Israel with their own information and their own intelligence as to the justification for why they've acted in the way they have. But what I can tell you is that this is a government, alongside previous New Zealand governments, that's long supported actions that means that Iran never, ever gets its hands on a nuclear weapon. That would be incredibly bad for the world if that was to ever happen. It's incredibly bad as it is that they're creating massive instability around the world, but particularly in the Middle East region because of their support of terrorist proxies. It's incredibly bad what's going on for the Iranian people, who are incredibly courageous, but actually getting killed by their own government.
But the two statements aren't quite matching up.
Do you think the attack continues to undermine the rules-based order under which small countries like New Zealand depend?
Well, again, I can't talk to the legality of the attacks as I've just tried to explain. The US and Israel have party to information and intelligence that I haven't seen, haven't been party to. And it's not just me saying that. There's many leaders around the world who actually are qualifying their statements because they're in the same position. We are not party to the information that they have seen. All we have heard is the self-defence claim under Article 51 in the UN Security Council as a justification for the attacks that have taken place. But we are not best placed to say, we're not best placed to sit here when we're not central to the region and not central to this conflict, sitting here in New Zealand, passing judgment on that. That is up to the Americans and the Israelis to assert the legal basis for their attacks.
Why haven't we asked to see it, Prime Minister?
Sorry?
Why haven't we asked to see it?
Well, that is up for the Americans and the Israelis to make the assertion.
We're independent.
They
We can
have
ask for it, though.
Sorry?
We are independent when we can ask for it and they can say no, but why not us?
And they have gone to the UN and invoked Article 51 and say that they have justification for self-defence.
What about other countries that pursue nuclear weapons like North Korea? Would you support another repressive regime?
Yeah, hypothetical. each situation we need to deal with.
Justification, I guess.
Sorry?
It's the same justification.
Well, you see us doing, and we have lifted our efforts tremendously to make sure we are supporting with 10 or 12 other countries UN sanctions against North Korea with respect to what they're doing. We're supporting Russia in their war in Ukraine, for example, and we've stepped up our obligations there and playing our part there.
I guess the issue is for decades, repressive regimes, aggressive regimes, has not been seen to justify regime change and military intervention in those countries. The importance of territorial sovereignty has been respected, regardless of how dreadful a particular regime could be. Do you sort of reject that approach?
No, I'm just giving you the fact that New Zealand has long supported actions that are preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. That is something that's in the world's interest, right? All of our interest, that never ever happens.
Even if the action comes at the loss of some 200 lives of school children?
Well, again, that is up for the US and the Israelis. I noticed they've got, with respect to the school bombing, that is up to them to argue, to present what has happened there, because I'm not in a position to judge that from sitting in New Zealand and just jumping to an assumption or a conclusion there. That is up for them.
Have you had any advice on the potential economic impacts for New Zealand out of all of this?
Look, we're going to have to wait and see. You would have seen, I think the futures markets opened, just a couple of hours ago. It was quite a muted response. I think you've seen markets over the subsequent weeks with the build-up of the American military presence in the region actually pricing it into their markets. So it looks like a fairly muted response. OPEC has been producing more oil over the last few weeks and recent months as well. So, it looks like quite a muted response as we sit here today with the markets about to open when you look at the futures exchanges, which are a good indication of where it will go. But obviously, we need to wait and see.
You can't make a judgment call on whether...
Sorry, hang on.
You can't make a judgment call on whether the deaths of 200 school children in a bombing is a good or bad thing. Is that what you said?
Well, we want to make sure that any action is protecting civilians. We want to make sure that any action is consistent with international law. But we also, need Israel and the US to explain their actions and their understanding of that event, and that is for them to explain.
You won't ask them to explain their actions.
Sorry?
You won't ask them to explain their actions or their
Well, it is up to them to explain their actions, right? And that's what they have said. They've both come out. I've seen the same media reports that you have seen as well, which is to say that they are looking into that event in particular, and it's up to them to explain after they undertake their review of what has happened there.
So you won't make reports that suggest that the US Department of Defense or Department of War, in an intelligence analysis last year, said there was no imminent threat from Iran to the United States, that the country is many years away from being able to build missiles that might be able to strike the United States. And if you've seen that, what do you make of that compared to the American justification that they were under imminent threat?
Well, again, that is not something I can talk to because I'm not party, as I've been saying, to the information or intelligence. No, but I'm not. No, that's dangerous. We go off facts here, and it's important that we don't just jump to conclusions that are easy. We actually need to make sure one way or another way. And so for me, all I'm trying to be honest with you is saying, look, I'm not party to that information or that intelligence, and therefore I'm not best placed to make that assessment. That is up for the Americans and the Israelis to do so, and to assert why they have acted with legality in these attacks, and also the information that they may have that we're not party to seeing. That is not inconsistent with what you've seen other world leaders say, and the way that they've had to qualify their remarks as well, because they're in exactly the same position. Sorry, guys. Can we just go? Everyone get a go. Can we just go quietly?
Have you had any discussion of this matter with other world leaders in recent days, and have you had any discussions with other world leaders about maybe helping to repatriate New Zealanders stuck in the region?
Look, I haven't had an opportunity to catch up with other world leaders on the topic. It's been a pretty fast-moving situation since Saturday evening, as you're well aware of. But with respect to New Zealanders at this point in time, obviously all airspace is closed and will be so for the foreseeable future, I imagine. That's why we're saying to New Zealanders, look, please follow the local advice, take shelter, make sure you register with safe travel in the intervening period, and then when commercial flights resume, if you wish to leave, that's the right time to do so. Do so if you feel you want to.
Can I just, New Zealand, if Dubai does open periodically, this is a question from one of our readers, will the New Zealand government help repatriate citizens who can't leave via Doha?
Yeah, look, it's just too soon for us to say on any of that. I mean, at the moment, the situation is the airspace is closed, as you well know. As I said, when commercial flights reconvene and recommence, there's a lot of them that go through the hub of the Middle East, whether it's in Doha, whether it's in Dubai or frankly other places, and that's the time to use the commercial flights. It's just too early for us to ascertain what's needed. As I said to you, we reckon we've got about 1,750 registered on safe travel that are in the region, 1,000 in Dubai, and even if you think it's 5 times bigger than that, you're talking about 5,000 people potentially. And many of them, frankly, have been long-term expatriates that live and work in the region and may have lived there for a decade or so. But at the moment, it's just way too early for us to make it.
Ambassador, is there any consideration?
Hang on. Sorry, mate.
You talked a couple of times today about how this is a repressive regime since 1979, but if we go before that, it was a repressive regime before. That's what spawned the uprising in Iran. And I'm just keen to get your perspective on, given this intervention we've seen, what confidence do you have that we will see peace in Iran?
Well, again, that's going to be ultimately a decision for the Iranian people to make. The 93 million of them all get to make a decision as to who they represents them as a government and as a leadership. But all I can say to you is the regime that we have grown up with, that has been in place since our generation has come through, has been an incredibly repressive one that has been pursuing nuclear weapons, sponsoring terrorism, destabilising the world and the region, and actually brutally repressing its own people.
Ambassador, is there any consideration being given?
Hang on, sorry.
Is there any
question? Sorry, there's a question. Someone hasn't had a question yet, so let's go there.
Do you have any meetings, phone calls, briefings at all with American counterparts or officials tonight or in the coming days?
Our officials will continue to talk, and that's per normal. That happens regularly on an ongoing basis, and I presume there'll be more conversation about the actions here and what the goals are and how much longer it may go on. But that's ultimately for our officials to have those conversations.
Sorry, is there any intention to increase pressure or at least ask for that intelligence in the future that you were speaking to earlier?
Well, again, those are to be determined, but I just say to you that ultimately an American the country of America and the US has acted in its own self-interest and its own national interest based off its own intelligence and information, which we are not party to. And so, that's why I say it's been an independent action, and that's why I say, and you're hearing other world leaders say, that is not something we have been party to or have information around. But what we do know is that we've supported long-standing actions that actually are about making sure that Iran never ever gets a nuclear weapon. That would be a terrible thing for the world.
An observation
last question.
An observation of your sort of defence and security posture, this government's posture and outlook, is that it is more pro-American than its predecessors. What would you make of that observation? Would you agree with it or disagree with it?
I think there's nothing that's changed. We have our own independent foreign policy, no doubt about it. As I've said to you in my State of the Nation speech, the international rules-based system is breaking down. It's been a disruptive period of time, the rules-based system of the last 70 years. We're seeing countries that are exercising power over rules. We're seeing a move from economics to security. We're seeing a shift from low-cost global supply chains to national resilience. Those are the macro themes.
No difference from previous governments.
We have an independent foreign policy and we act in our own brutal national interests.
I'm going to go
to the last question. Sorry, the gentleman behind.
Sorry, Ambassador, Prime Minister?
Sorry, hang on. Mikey, just shouting doesn't get the question. Can we just take turns? Be respectful.
It's not coming back around, so I just want to check if you're going to move to expel the Iranian ambassador.
No, thanks, mate.
You haven't asked for the information, but you're saying that the government's position is determined. This will be determined based on that information. Are we just waiting for the United States to release that information, or
no?
How does the government come to a position in absence of that information?
Well, the government is supportive of any actions that means that Iran never gets its hands on a nuclear weapon. The government is supportive of any action that means that Iran can't pursue funding terrorist organisations, and our government is supportive of any actions that means that they don't keep killing their people. That has been a long-standing commitment of the New Zealand governments under successive parties and colours and persuasions. That has not changed. But with respect to the specifics as to the US actions, independent actions of the US and Israel, as I've said before, they are party to information intelligence that we haven't seen.
Okay. Please focus back to Mikey's question.
Sorry.
We're getting questions from Iranian.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
We're getting questions from Iranian Kiwis who want an answer on why you won't expel the Iranian ambassador.